Well, I think you all know my name, but my name's Keturaja. Just in case you don't know who I am, it's lovely to see so many people here, particularly on such a pleasant evening outside. Summer feels like it's finally arrived, doesn't it? Okay, so we'll start by saluting the shrine. We'll do this in call and response. Namo Buddhaya.
Namo Buddhaya.
Namo Dhammaya.
Namo Dhammaya.
Namo Sanghaya.
Namo Sanghaya.
Namo Namah.
Namo
Om. Hong. Great. Well, it's lovely to be here on Dharma night. So it's been a little while since I did anything on Dharma night, so I've been doing some courses with some of the people here now, which is great, on Tuesday nights. So it's lovely to be here and, well, to see so many people here. So we're at the beginning of a new series. I'm not quite sure how this series popped. I think it was popped into my mind. It seemed to come out of a dialogue with Arthur Siddhi. But somehow I found myself engaging with this particular topic. So I think most of you know what we're going to be looking at over the next 6 weeks. So it's the 6 distinctive emphases of the Triratna community. That's rather a mouthful, isn't it? So it's 6. We're going to be looking at 6 distinctive features of the tradition, of the Triratna community, of which obviously the centre is very much a part. So this evening is going to be both something of a little bit of an introduction to this series, what it's about, and also I'm going to be looking at one of those 6 emphases, one of those 6 features. Yeah. I think in looking at these features, in a way it's trying to tune into something of the character of Triratna. If Triratna was a person, we're trying to tune in to the character of the person, what it's like to meet that character. And you could say that in the sense the centre exists to invite people in to participate and in a way practice through and with these 6 emphases. Yeah. In a way, what we're trying to do in providing these 6 emphases, these 6 features, is we're aiming to try and provide effective means for people to practice. People to practice here, now, at this time in history, and in this time, and in this particular culture. So, as I say, we'll be exploring these emphases in different ways over the next 6 weeks. So it won't all be people up the front talking. There'll be a bit more of a dialogue, a bit more of interaction. Okay, so let me work my way into this topic. I think you could say that, well, any kind of spiritual life which aims to make growth and development of awareness possible, to allow our innate potential to unfold, I think you could say it needs, at least at the beginning, 2 key components. And those you'll be familiar with. So I want to talk a little bit about integration and positive emotion. Yeah. So in order to practice effectively, we need to bring the diverse elements of our psyche into relationship with each other. Yeah? We need to bring our energies together around a guiding principle. We need to align our energies, if you like, with our deeper values, what is most important to us. And if we can do that, that allows our awareness to sort of more naturally unfold, to deepen and broaden, and allowing our potential and all kinds of qualities to unfold. So there's that element of integration. And then there's positive emotion. In a way, you could say positive emotion, working on positive emotion, is about learning the art of being receptive to ourselves, receptive to our emotional lives. And on that basis, being able to direct our emotional energies towards that which is most helpful for ourselves and for other people. From another perspective, you could say positive emotion involves allowing a natural empathetic connection with others, with all life, allowing that empathetic connection to guide our emotions and guide our actions. And ultimately, we want to be going beyond ourselves to a wider identification that frees us up from a more from habitual self preoccupation. So that's probably enough about those. But in a way, if they are essential features of the spiritual life, then a question arises: well, what are the best conditions? What are the best support to bring about that integration, to bring about a flowering of positive emotion? And that is where these 6 emphases come in, these 6 features of the Triratna community come in. There are 6 characteristics that, in a way, you could say, provide the best conditions, the best approach for us to at least get started on the spiritual path. Yeah. And as I said, they aim to be the best conditions for us now within this particular culture we live in, which is quite a complex culture, a multifaceted culture, not a unitary culture. I'll say more about this later. So it's about providing the best conditions for us at this time within this culture, within this sort of society that we live in. I don't know whether you call it an industrial society or a post-industrial society or a global society. There's probably many ways you can describe our society. But what Triratna is trying to do is to create the conditions for a practice to be effective where we are now. Yeah. So, a couple of things here. Well, these characteristics, these features, these emphases, they're not there by chance. Yeah, they're not there just because, oh, that looks good, or Sangharakshita, the founder of the movement, just thought, oh, I like that, we'll include that as an emphasis. They're considered. So just as, it's a bit different. If I was to describe, my face, you might see one ear slightly bigger than the other, or particular colour eyes, and a bit sort of swarthy around here, heavy, not quite a beard. But that's sort of by chance and the genetics of my parents. But actually, these features of Triratna are different than that. They come about through consideration, through quite a bit of consideration, and observing the experience of people. So what's considered is both the history of the Buddhist tradition as a whole, having some kind of understanding or sense of the kind of society, the kind of culture we actually live in right now. And also just observing, as I said, how the Dharma, what is effective for those practicing here now at the moment. So all those factors went into drawing out these 6 emphases. So not only are they not by chance, they're considered, but they also work together. That's what I realised when I began to look at this group of 6. They work together, they overlap, they support each other, they work with each other to provide conditions. And in a way I thought very loosely, you could see them as a mandala. So I've drawn this very loose mandala over here on the flip chart here, just to draw out these different features. So I'm going to give a little bit of just a summary of these. So it's not surprising to those who are familiar with Triratna that the centrality of going for refuge is at the centre of the mandala, in a way. All the other features, in a way, you could say grow out of that particular central place within the mandala. So it's a way, it's not surprising that going for refuge is there. It's, in a way, it represents the three most valued things for Buddhists: the Dharma, the Buddha, and the Sangha. So they're at the centre there. But out of that, all these other features arise. So, and I'm not going to say too much about them because we'll explore these over the next 6 weeks. But there's the importance of friendship. Triratna emphasises friendship. You might have noticed that. And in a way, the Triratna community take very seriously the Buddha's injunction to Ananda. He said, no, Ananda, the spiritual life is not half or a fraction of the spiritual life. Spiritual friendship is the whole of the spiritual life. And what does that mean? Well, we'll be exploring that later in this series. Then there's what we call here a unified order. So having a unified order, what does that mean? Yeah. So that's the principle that the Triratna order is open to all, irrespective of class, race, sexual orientation, and so on. Although we talk here about a unified order, the principle is that we want to aim, whether we succeed is another matter, but we're aiming to make the Dharma available to practice for anyone who comes along, for all. That's the sort of ideal, really. To make the Dharma available for anyone who has an interest and wants to follow that up. Then there's right livelihood over here. So that's kind of interesting. So that pays attention to, we are in a particular society where our livelihood is often a bit separate from the rest of our lives, separate from our family or friends. So this particular emphasis of looking and exploring our livelihood, and in a way it's sort of broader than livelihood, it's our sort of relationship with society, trying to bring that into and integrate that with the rest of our spiritual life. So we'll be spending a week exploring that topic. Then there's the arts here. Yes, the arts are very important, give an emphasis within the tradition, the Triratna tradition. In a way, the arts provide an opportunity to engage our imagination, engage our energies, our more deeper energies for the Dharma. If we can engage with the best of the arts within our culture, not necessarily Buddhist arts, then that can engage us more deeply, lift and refine our energies, and bring more into our spiritual life. And of course, it's just enjoyable in itself, engaging with the arts in one way or another, whether through appreciation or through practice. So we'll be having an evening exploring that dimension. So that just leaves what I'm going to say a bit more about tonight, which is entitled here the non-sectarian approach. So I'll say a bit more about that in a moment, what that means. Yeah. So I'm going to stop there. So, well, no, I'll say a little bit about this. The non-sectarian approach. In a way, the other word, which is rather sort of, is ecumenical, which sounds rather, it's a Christian term. But in that context, it means looking to the whole of a tradition. So in our case, what we were saying here is Triratna community looks to the whole of the Buddhist tradition, both across the whole of the world where Buddhism has developed, and also right through the whole history of Buddhism. It looks to that whole spectrum for inspiration and guidance. However, not in an uncritical way. So that's what we'll be exploring. It's not that everything practiced all at once seems to work. So that's what we'll be looking at. Anyway, before I say any more, I'm going to suggest we just break out into 2s or 3s, and I've got a couple of questions. So the question is, where do you find inspiration within the Buddhist tradition? Yeah, maybe it's the Buddha, or it might be other figures, practices, teachings and practices. And what is it about these figures or particular practices or teachings that you find uplifting, that you find inspiring? Yeah, does that make sense? So let's just have a few minutes, maybe just partner up or with someone sitting next to you and see what.
It's coming out from the fact that that's what I'm doing for a period of time. Yeah, over a long period.
For me, so to say that I find just as suppose I should start you sitting over here and that's not
another Buddha, that would happen.
yeah, but we're not talking see, this one, if you read to the Buddhists, there are whole eons, like whole world systems. And we think, oh, it's different. Oh, yeah, I have to engage with Dharma. You can't know this. I actually like teaching him just in ways he wouldn't have had to say. Purely density, purely terrible. Oh, he wouldn't have done that.
I think I have all
I mean, I don't know what
Interesting when you decide to stay and teach other people.
Well, I mean, there are so-called
Okay, I think I probably could have let you run on a bit longer there, but anyway, we've got groups after the tea break, so if you want to explore things a bit more. But or maybe we've got time, just a couple of people just say, are there particular figures or particular things within the Buddhist tradition that is particularly inspiring someone at the moment? I don't know if anybody wants to mention something.
I said retreats are inspirational.
Right. Yeah.
Experience.
Yeah. So that's something that almost every tradition has. Retreats.
Can you repeat?
Sorry. We were talking about retreats and the inspiration that comes through being on retreats. So yeah, I was sort of saying that's something we share with pretty much every tradition. Some emphasise it a bit more than others.
I was quite struck by the range of things that we were inspired by.
Yes.
So we had stories, we had the sort of logical approach to Buddhism, we had pujas, and we had... but we had a range of different things. I was quite struck by the range of different things that people would draw inspiration from.
I think that is interesting. I think that is a feature of Tirana, that people were inspired by quite a range from the Buddhist tradition. Even as I was chatting to someone who is visiting someone from another tradition, and I won't say what tradition, and on their bookshelf they just had a few books, but all in relation to that tradition. But I think almost every order member I visited their home, they have a really vast array of books from very many different traditions. So I think for me, that point, and what you're saying there points to within our community, people look very broadly for inspiration and gain inspiration from quite a wide range of sources within the history and the traditions of the Dharma. Anything else before we move on? Or?
We were talking about the word that was used a lot in our group was integration. So we're three very different people.
Right.
We all found that we could find something that inspired us that, was for everyday folks. That's what we were saying. There's always something where we come along and go, oh, that's an interesting word. So like right livelihood, none of us had heard that term before we came here.
Okay.
So maybe there's something around exploring words. I've heard the word right and I've heard the word livelihood, but I've not heard right livelihood. So perhaps that's inspiring as well to us to just think about, well, what does that mean? What do those words mean here?
Yeah. And what are the principles behind them or something? Yeah. Good. Okay. I'll keep an eye on the clock. So I'll say a little bit more about this, what might be called a non-sectarian approach. So what does that mean? So I'll try and unfold that a bit. Well, it's in a particular sense that Triratna is non-sectarian in that it doesn't identify solely with any particular school or tradition of the Dharma. So, for example, we don't identify exclusively with Sri Lankan Buddhism or Buddhism from Tibet or from Japan. So those regions. And also Triratna doesn't align itself with any particular school of Buddhism in the sense of Hinayana, which is early Buddhism, later Buddhism of the Mahayana, or the kind of Vajrayana or Tantric Buddhism that you find in Tibet. Neither Zen nor Theravada. So there isn't that exclusive identification, but that doesn't mean to say we don't find sources of inspiration in all those schools, as it were. So within Triratna, you'll find people who are showing respect and reverence to figures and teachings throughout the whole range of the Buddhist tradition, gaining inspiration from that whole history of Buddhism. Right from the Buddha 2,500 years ago and his early disciples. You may read, in the Pali Canon, you read about very inspiring men and women who were the first followers of the Buddha. Right through to the spiritual heroes of the Mahayana. Sometimes they're called the Siddhas, the great sort of ascetics, great practitioners, great teachers of the Dharma. And then there's also Buddhist scholars like Shantideva, and right through to mythical figures or semi-mythical figures like Padmasambhava in Tibet. So Triratna looks to quite a wide range of figures and teachings. The 2,500 years of Buddhist history is very rich. There's a lot of inspiring practitioners, realized masters, men and women who've really exemplified the spiritual life. And you can now read their stories. You could get a sense of their lives. When I was writing this, I was thinking of the life of Milarepa. It's just a great story. It's a great yarn. A very inspiring figure. So there's biographies, which also can be very uplifting. Then, of course, as I said, there's teachings, practices, rituals, imagery. There's so much more. So for me, I think personally, I find bringing to mind this sort of almost like vast lineage through that 2,500 years. I don't know, it's somehow, and having a sense that we're heirs to that lineage, all that practice we can call on in some ways. Having that in mind really expands and enhances what it means for me to practice the Dharma. I can say more about that. It enriches to feel that I'm part of a tradition, part of a lineage. It's as though there's almost like there's a great river that comes from the mountains. It's accumulated and got a force to it, and we can choose if we like to bathe in that river. It's broadened out to bathe in it, even though doing so can be a bit bracing sometimes. The mountain streams can be a bit bracing. So for me, it's enriching to have a sense that I'm an heir, or we are heirs to that vast spiritual lineage. But there's a but here. But with modern communication, online availability, we can now gain access to a bewildering multitude of translations, teachings from pretty much all the great Buddhist schools. We can access talks and videos, a whole range online, an array of teachings and practices. So many, pretty much all the key texts are available now in translation. And we can be guided online in all sorts of meditations. I think it's useful just for me to remember that, 50, 60 years ago, not that long ago, much less was available. There were just a few translations, a few scattered books on Buddhism. So this has all changed really in the last 50 years. So on one level, this is great, isn't it? We have access to this, these teachings, this rich plethora of stories and information and about the Dharma. But it does present us with a challenge. Well, I think it presents us with a challenge. How do we make use of this vast array, this diversity of teachings? It's almost like a tsunami. So although much is inspiring, or a lot is inspiring, there are also teachings from the different traditions that seem to slightly contradict each other. Or how does the Zen teaching here fit with this teaching over here from the Theravada school? How do they fit? And some teachings don't seem to quite make sense. And there's even some elements that you think, can't quite agree with that, I can't quite swallow that. So how do we make sense of this variety? How can we bring together an approach that we can have confidence in and get behind? How can we, maybe most importantly, how can we choose a coherent set of practices and approaches that is effective for us? And it's effective for us here now in the 21st century. So there's a few questions there really. So what I want to do, I don't want to feel I can't completely answer those questions. But what I want to do is to just maybe introduce a few considerations about how we might begin to look at those kind of questions. So the first thing is that I think it's useful to have at least some sense of the historical development of Buddhism. Buddhism developed over the centuries in many different and divergent ways. Often due to it travelling to new locations, new geographical locations, and those locations being a bit separate or isolated from other cultures or other contact with other peoples. And also Buddhism developed through encountering new cultures and new peoples. In some cases, Buddhism brought with it almost wholesale the culture from which it came in India. But in other cases, Buddhism encountered a much more developed or even highly developed cultures. The example that came to mind here was China. It's a few hundred years after the passing of the Buddha that Buddhist texts travelled or were passed to China, and there was a whole process of translation that went on for several centuries. And in response to the Buddhism within Indian culture, or expressed within an Indian culture, meeting another culture, all sorts of different schools arose. In a way, trying to find a way to communicate the essence of Buddhism to people within that Chinese culture. But also, in a way, also often responding to what the expression of the Dharma within an Indian culture, which was a bit alien in some ways to Chinese culture. So this is how Buddhism developed in different ways, in response to different culture, different situations, different people, and the development happened in isolation from the different centres of Buddhism. So I think it's interesting to have a sense of how that happened. And of course, one of the things that we uniquely bring from where we are now is a historical perspective. We forget that other people often didn't have that same kind of historical perspective, or not to the same amount of detail, or not to the same extent that we have it now. In a way, it's a product of the development of science, development of thought, over the last 200 or 300 years. So we're able to bring a perspective to that history and see how teachings developed through the study of texts, archaeology, language. They sort of begin to show us how Buddhist ideas developed and why. And it reveals that to some extent how Buddhism developed also happened to some extent because of that lack of historical perspective. So an example of that is, I think probably even today you'd find in China that many Buddhists believe the White Lotus Sutra. Well, the White Lotus Sutra is one of the most famous Chinese texts. But many Chinese people would view that as being the sort of verbatim word of the Buddha, the verbatim teaching of the Buddha. But actually, if you looked at the science of it, that doesn't really add up. It's difficult, certainly difficult for me. Maybe you feel able to believe, but I can't quite believe that sutra came directly from the Buddha. By the way, that doesn't mean to say, for me, that sutra is a very powerful and profound teaching, and in a way, is very much deserves to be revered. There is, as it were, you can say, this is one of our Subhuti, or one of our teachers, sort of said, well, sometimes you can get a sense from a text that there is a profound, deep mind behind a particular teaching or behind a particular text. So for me, it doesn't mean to say that it has to be the word of the Buddha. That's a certain type of literalism. Anyway, I'm trying to just sort of say, having some sense of how Buddhism developed helps us, I think, to see what is of the essence of the Dharma and what is relevant to us practicing now. So as well as the history, there's also the sense that Buddhism often developed in quite isolated traditional societies. As Buddhism developed in different societies, different cultures, it often became embedded, deeply embedded within the host culture. So a really good example of this, I think, is Tibetan Buddhism. We find that it is deeply embedded within a rich, complex and colourful culture. But it's a culture that, in a way, is still rooted a bit in a medieval social structure. But it's really difficult to separate Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, say, from Tibetan culture. It's pretty impossible, really. And for Tibetans, this isn't a problem. It's not a problem at all, because it is their culture, and they can practice through that culture. But for us, it's a bit different. We're not Tibetan Buddhists. So how do we? But understanding something of the culture of Tibet, we can again begin to have a sense of what is the essence of Buddhism within that tradition, and what maybe is more cultural or accretional, even cultural baggage, one might say. So there are two things I think it's useful to consider. So Sangharakshita, the founder of Triratna, saw very much this from first-hand experience. Living in India and coming into contact with people from China, teachers from China, Tibet, he very much saw he got a sense of these different traditions, and also with his encounters with teachers from different schools. I think it's always interesting to note that Sangharakshita seemed to find the most easy kinship with those teachers who were less embedded in their culture, or those who more had a sense of relating to Buddhism as a whole, relating to the whole Buddhist tradition, not just a particular school. But Sangharakshita, although not the first to view Buddhism in this broader historical and cultural perspective, I think he perhaps was the first to see its significance and the depth of its implications. Yeah, from a very early age, Sangharakshita saw the need to identify with the whole of the Buddhist tradition, but not without bringing a critical faculty to different presentations of the Dharma. In fact, I think he was, he might be able to correct me here, but I think Sangharakshita was 18, was 20 when he first wrote a piece for a Buddhist magazine in which he outlined what he thought was the importance of relating to the whole of the Buddhist tradition and not just one aspect. So it's uncanny that he seemed to sort of see that almost, or just at the point actually he became a Buddhist. So Sangharakshita saw the need to separate out what is the essence of the Dharma, essence of Buddhism, from almost extraneous cultural elements, even cultural baggage, if you like. But most, he saw that the Dharma, to be most effective, needs to be communicated through the medium of the culture in which Buddhism is hosted, as it were. So this need for translation into our own cultural medium he saw as being essential. And in a way, he was just seeing what had happened through the history of Buddhism. That's what happened. Slowly, Buddhism found expression through the medium of the culture in which it found itself. So out of this consideration, he decided a new Buddhist movement was needed. This was not something that happened overnight. It was through much consideration. He thought that a new Buddhist movement needed to come about, and for it to have certain characteristics. So I'm just going to outline these as I move towards the end of this presentation. So firstly, a Buddhism in the West, a Buddhism in our modern society needs to embrace this historical perspective that I've been talking about. There are benefits in this sort of calling on the scholars and the scientific approach to the history of Buddhism. We can learn from it. We don't need to push it aside or ignore it. It can enhance. It can, in a way, reveal some of the gems of the Dharma that have maybe been lost in history. They can be revealed and come to shine again. But any Buddhist movement, any tradition, needs to communicate to the Dharma as individuals within our modern society and culture. Buddhism needs to be communicated in and through our own language, both literally and metaphorically. It needs to take into consideration our current culture, the society of which we're part. It needs to speak personally to us in a way that can be understood by us and that sparks us off. It needs to enable us to connect deeply with the Buddha's teaching. And then a new tradition needs to relate and engage with all parts of our psyche, all parts of our being. Put another way, if Buddha's teaching is to be effective, it needs to engage, activate all our energies, free up and refine, focus our energies. It needs to bring us alive in all aspects of our being. And that's why I hope we'll draw out a bit with the other 5 characteristics as we go on. And then lastly here, the Dharma needs, in order to be effective, one needs a coherent set of practices that work together, that support each other, that work together to deepen our awareness. I suppose an image here I had was, I don't know if this completely works, but was a jigsaw. I don't know if any of you do jigsaws. I occasionally do them in the winter, not in the summer. But in the winter I do a jigsaw. And there are some, you get series, don't you? Like there was a series I was following up which had marine animals from different places around the world. So all these images from these jigsaws, they're very attractive, and you can be attracted by these different jigsaws. But if you pick a bit from one jigsaw and pick a bit from another jigsaw, can you see it doesn't often fit together? So you need a Dharma, you need a jigsaw that fits together into a whole, that works together to create a picture that is engaging and inspiring. So drawing together the key principles, emphasis and features of Triratna community. Just to finish off here, Sangharakshita drew both on the inspiration of his teachers, on his own personal practice and experience, and you can get a sense of this in his memoirs. Then he observed what worked, and more importantly, he observed, particularly when he came back to the UK from India, he observed what didn't work. So there's an element in how Triratna evolved, was an observation of what worked and what didn't work in both the East and the West. Yeah. And increasingly, Sangharakshita found that he found referencing early Buddhism, the Buddhism that is maybe most close to, that we have the teachings most close to the Buddha himself, often contain the core teachings that are most essential. And he came to think, he had this phrase, that there are no higher teachings but only deeper understandings. No higher teachings but only deeper understandings. And in a way, early Buddhism has those core elements. They are developed and enhanced through later traditions to great effect. But all the main elements of the Dharma are there in early Buddhism. So the kind of, as it were, culture of Triratna, the emphasis of Triratna, emerged over time, emerged particularly in the early part of the Triratna community when things were being tried out in the late 60s and 70s. Sangharakshita he's not the kind of person who had a master plan of how it was all going to work. In a sense, there's an experimental element. But what has emerged through that is a set of teachings, I think a coherent set of teachings that fit together. And that's in a way what we're exploring in these 6 weeks. And even with Sangharakshita no longer being with us, there is still development there. a living tradition cannot completely stand still. It has to adapt and find new modes of expression. Yeah. So I personally feel very fortunate to be guided by, guided in my practice through Sangharakshita's view and his working out with the early order members within Triratna. That I feel grateful that they pull together a group of practices that look broadly, that find inspiration and find uplift throughout the whole Buddhist tradition, but are formed into a coherent whole that seem to work. At least they seem to work for me. Yeah. And it's interesting. It's funny, Sangharakshita is sometimes seen as both a conservative and a radical in a way. And I think, looking at his history, if he had found a tradition that he felt he could practice with integrity, to fully give himself to, then he would have been quite happy to do that. It was only because through his searching he didn't feel that was possible, and he didn't feel that the older traditions in themselves were working for people in this society, in this time, and this culture, that he felt the need to create something new. And in doing so, in a way, he was quite radical. It was a radical move. Yeah. And in doing so, he set about initiating a community that, in a way, as I say, has taken the best, I think, from the whole Buddhist tradition and communicate it through the medium of our modern global culture. So I hope over the next 6 weeks that these 6 emphases are going to draw that out a bit more and draw out Triratna's approach. Yep. So, when is the tea break? 15:15, is it? 10 past. It is 10 past. It is perfect timing.
To go back to the Chinese way of Buddhism and the Tibetan, is there any sort of general idea of integrating the various ones from we hear about the Dalai Lama and the problems he has with the Chinese, but it's not with the Chinese Buddhists, it's probably with the Chinese communists or something like that.
I think that's probably the case.
I'm guessing that. But is there a general sort of integration, or like you found your niche there from 70 years ago and you're following that, and are all the Buddhists sort of doing the same, or is there a general feeling that we should integrate more or they should integrate more?
There's some big questions there, which in a way I don't think I can answer. But I do think that very much there is dialogue and the kinship between the different traditions, and with global travel and internet and online, there is much more communication and dialogue between the different traditions. So I think many of the teachers from different schools will be aware. But I think many are still feel comfortable within their tradition, yes, and they want to continue to teach through their tradition, which obviously is fine.